Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for everybody to come into the room, so to speak, and we'll kick off in a few seconds. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name's Elizabeth Sideropoulos from the South African Institute of International Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to have you all joining us, even though we cannot see you, for this webinar on foreign policy in uncertain times. What are the options for South Africa's climate change diplomacy? The reason we're a little late is because we've had some technical issues, some of which I think we have resolved, and I'll come to that in a little in a few moments. Just over 2 years ago, Professor Danny Bradlow, and I, Danny, of course, as you probably know, is at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, began working on a book project on South Africa's foreign policy in the 2020s. Okay, what options did South Africa have under a new president? Certainly when we began the discussion, we still had former President Zuma in power. So what would a new president do with our foreign policy in the 2020s? Against the background of growing international polarization and the erosion of multilateralism. This book that is finally close to completion, close to publication, is entitled Values, Interests and Power, South Africa's Foreign Policy in Uncertain Times. And you probably saw a little picture of the front cover on the holding slide as you came in. Climate diplomacy is one of the issues it covers. And while the book was in production, of course, when all the chapters had been completed, COVID-19 happened. That has upended a lot of the things that we have all been working on. But one of the things that has been repeatedly made, or one of the points that has been repeatedly made, is that this now provides a unique opportunity to take bold action on the topic of climate change. Building back better should be about the green recovery, using the huge fiscal stimuli not to entrench old habits, but to chart a new path within our planetary boundaries. And that has implications for each country, both in terms of their domestic policies and initiatives, as well as the way in which these played out regionally and internationally. And so in that sense, South Africa's climate diplomacy will be a crucial element of our foreign policy in the rest of the decade. This discussion, therefore, this morning begins with a presentation by Ellen Davies, who is one of the authors of the climate chapter in the book, together with Salim Fakir, who is also in the green room with us, or the pink room, as some people call it this morning, as well as Melisha Nagaya. They are also the co-authors of a policy briefing, which was just published, drawing on the chapter, but also bringing in some new elements linked to COVID-19. We will post the link to the policy briefing in the chat function just now. Then we will Ellen will be followed, and I'll introduce each of them specifically, by Ambassador Saini Nafu, who is the African climate, from the African group of negotiators on climate change, the spokesperson, and he's joining us from Berlin. we're very grateful that the technical glitches have been addressed. Welcome, Ambassador, and we will correct your name there on the screen as well. And then hopefully we'll also manage to get Alf Wills, the former DDG of South Africa's Department of Environmental Affairs, onto the Zoom. He's also experiencing some technical problems. So we'll see how it goes. So let me then just very briefly introduce Ellen Davies, who is actually joining us from Niger at this time, and we hope that your link also continues to be strong. She's been working on issues of sustainable economic development for the past 8 years. She's currently working as a consultant for the African Climate Foundation, a new organization. We were talking a little earlier that is sort of just over four months old and is, I think, already doing some great work. It's really lovely to be able to collaborate with the foundation, with Salim, with Ellen, on this initiative, and again to thank them very much for their contribution to our book. She's also was previously a project manager on the extractive sector at the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. Let me leave it there. Let me hand over to you, Ellen, and then I'll introduce the ambassador after your interventions. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me? Just to check that great. So as Elizabeth mentioned, what I'm going to be presenting now is based on the policy brief that Salim, myself, and Melisha wrote. What I'd like to do with my time is the following. I'm going to begin by providing the context. What is this uncertainty that we're talking about, and how is and will this impact global climate change efforts? Then to provide some framing for how we can think through the implications that this will have on the climate change architecture, and how this might affect a country like South Africa. And then against this background, I would like to suggest firstly what we think South Africa's immediate climate change objectives should be. And then secondly, what we think, how we think South Africa could potentially garner international support outside of the UNFCCC process. So to begin with, what we've seen in the past few years, even before the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, is increasing uncertainty in the global political system. So shifts in the developed world had begun to challenge the rules-based system that has governed the world for some time. The Brexit, UK's Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, the rise of nationalism in parts of Europe have all begun to shake up the global order. The position taken by the US administration under the Trump presidency, challenging the very institutions that have been key to maintaining this order, such as the WTO, UN, NATO, have just further served to undermine this political system. Shifts in the developing world are also shaking up the global politics. So the continued rise of China is bringing other geopolitical tensions to the fore. And from South Africa's perspective, the election of Jair Bolsonaro and as president of Brazil and recent Indo-China tensions are bringing into question strategic developing country alliances such as the BRICS. And these shifts or these developments have also been playing out in the global climate change negotiations. So, for example, we saw the US's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, Brazil's withdrawal of its offer to host the 2020 COP, and renewed contestation about the legitimacy of climate science, as we saw at the Catalyst COP in 2018. And then COVID-19 has just added a whole additional layer of complexity and revealed serious weaknesses in the global economic and political system. So the result of COVID has been that countries have become more inward looking as they're attempting to deal with the ramifications, the socioeconomic and political implications in their own backyards. And for understandable reasons, have been less focused on collective action for things like climate change. So we can't predict how this is going to play out. But what I'd like to do is to provide or to suggest 3 potential scenarios of how things may unfold and what implications this may have on global climate change efforts. And against this background, to suggest what this might mean for South Africa. Of course, there are a whole host of potential scenarios, and within these 3 scenarios, there are obviously a host of potential variations. But what we think that this provides some framing with which to think through or a starting point for looking forward. Okay, so the first scenario is that the existing rules-based system is maintained. International institutions have staying power, geopolitical interests drive mutual dependence and global cooperation, and the most important determinant will be the US elections. The US elects a president and an administration that works to repair the existing system and global institutions. What this will mean for the international climate change architecture is that it's maintained and the UNFCCC remains the primary vehicle to pursue global climate change efforts. The second scenario is that the existing rules-based system becomes increasingly uncertain. International institutions are unable to make it work for the global collective. The US dominance and that of its allies is contested, and revisionist powers exploit fiction to weaken the US hegemony and undermine the prevailing order. And for the climate change architecture, this means that it will become increasingly undermined. More countries will potentially pull out of the Paris Agreement, and global efforts to reduce emissions will be thwarted. The final scenario is that there's a complete collapse of the existing international political system. US and China compete and to create mutually exclusive spheres of influence. International politics becomes a zero-sum game, and the UNFCCC is dismantled, and climate change actions are shaped by the interests of global powers. So I think that irrespective of which of these scenarios plays out, what seems most likely is that given the current period of uncertainty that we're in, and given our inability over the past 2 decades to achieve meaningful greenhouse gas emission reductions, that we're not on a path to meeting the emissions reductions by 2030, and that it is likely that we will see more than a higher than 1.5 degree global average temperature increase. What does this mean for South Africa? Is that climate change is and will have a big impact on the country. And that it has the ability to undo many of our developmental gains. It also has the ability to undermine many of our developmental objectives going forward. So what we suggest is that given this context, what South Africa needs to do urgently is to stop and recalibrate, and it needs to focus immediately and prioritize building adaptive capacity and resilience at the domestic level, but also in the region, because its ability to guard itself against climate change impacts will very much depend on the strength of its neighbors. There have been some very, very positive signs from government in the recent weeks and months. So President Ramaphosa's most recent Newsweek letter talked about the importance of not losing sight of climate change in the midst of COVID, of the need to reduce emissions, of the need to build adaptive capacity and resilience, also of the economic opportunities that climate change interventions hold. And I think that this is very important because climate change is not being positioned as a trade-off with development, but rather starting to be framed within the developmental lens. So looking at the opportunities that climate change have to unlock new economic opportunities. Also, we recently saw Cabinet adopt or approve the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, and the Climate Change Bill is before NEDLAC. And given how slow South Africa has been in putting in place the legislative framework with which to address climate change, these are very, very positive developments. So what are South Africa's options to pursue international support for its climate change objectives? We're not suggesting that South Africa abandons the UNFCCC process, but we do think that there are immediate opportunities that South Africa could seize to draw on international support at other fora and use its soft power influence to unlock green opportunities, not only for itself, but also for its neighbors and for the continent. The first and most immediate avenue is the Africa-Europe Summit that I think is taking place in October this year, with the new European Commission identifying climate change as its biggest threat and the European Green Deal as its flagship initiative. And given that President Ramaphosa is the current chair of the AU, there's immense potential and opportunity for African countries to put climate change support at the heart of the Africa-Europe Summit, and to potentially begin to even start thinking about how to shape an African New Green Deal. Another opportunity is the FOCAC in 2021, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, which will take place in Dakar. While South Africa won't be the chair of the AU at the time, it will be the chair in the lead up to the AU and in the setting of the agenda, in the lead up to the FOCAC and the setting of the agenda, and it has influence it has potential to influence this agenda and can provide support for the current adaptation initiatives taking place within the AU that Ambassador Nafu can talk to, and also has the potential to position itself for a flagship initiative, climate change initiative that could be agreed on at FOCAC in 2021. And finally, as Elizabeth mentioned, South Africa has the potential to, again, as AU chair and given its soft power influence, to support or spearhead green recovery in the COVID recovery packages, not only for itself, but also on behalf of the continent. And these are immediate opportunities that South Africa has the potential to seize to drive this climate change agenda. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Ellen. And we will be also posting the link to the policy briefing in the chat function during the course of the discussion. I think important to emphasize a number of what one might call policy windows over the next few months that South Africa can actually play a leadership role in, both with continentally, but also globally in climate diplomacy. I think we're still battling to get hold of Alf Wills. So what we will do is move to the ambassador. Let me introduce the ambassador, although I suspect many people are familiar with him. Ambassador, firstly, it's really great that you were able to make the time to join us this morning on what we think certainly is a critical issue, the climate emergency, and how we should be responding to it both as South Africa and as a continent. But by way of introduction, Ambassador SAIIA Nafu serves as the spokesperson for the African Group of Negotiators, a position that he has held since 2011. He also acts as the coordinator of the African Adaptation Initiative, a continent-wide initiative endorsed by the AU Assembly, which aims to strengthen adaptation to climate impacts in Africa. He also serves as the High Representative for the climate change to the served to the Malian president, a position he held since June 2019. And over the course of his career, Ambassador Nafu has made significant contributions to the continent and the developing world in the fields of climate change, renewable energy, and sustainable development. And I think if we're talking about what the pillars of any country's foreign policy should be going forward. I think those three dimensions really encapsulate it, because if our foreign policy doesn't focus and doesn't calibrate around the existential challenges that the planet faces, then I think we'll find out that all the countries' foreign policies are not going to take us very far if we don't deal with that. So, Ambassador, over to you. Look forward to hearing you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Because we had technical issues. I don't know if everything is set now.
Ambassador, just one thing. I think you've probably moved your device, so we're now seeing you on the side. That's good like that. Yes. Yeah. So now we're seeing you right way up. Yes. And we can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. And it's good to be here. It was very easy for me to prepare for this meeting because I've actually been quite blessed to be involved with South African colleagues and South African climate diplomacy for the last 10 years. My own career in the field has been quite close to what has happened and to what is taking place in South Africa. So, for instance, I was appointed as the spokesperson for the Africa Group on the way to Durban in 2011. The Africa Group felt that on top of the formal negotiation, there was a need to strengthen the African voice and to socialize our position to all different stakeholders. So I owe it to the Durban. Second is the South African team itself, the South African climate team, which to me is the most diverse, the most competent team. It's a team which has all kinds of expertise from public, private, CSOs, universities. And I had the good chance when I started as a lead negotiator to be mentored or to be trained by an elite team at the University of Cape Town and other institutions such as CSRR in South Africa. I think I sort of know all the South African acronyms. Anyway, so from the very beginning, one has to acknowledge South Africa's leadership. I think not just as an African country or a developing country. South Africa was probably one of the first to understand the power of climate diplomacy and to integrate climate diplomacy in its overall diplomatic agenda. And one has to see that in 2011, we always talk about the Paris Agreement in 2015, but it was in Durban in 2011 that what we call the Durban Round was launched. And in Durban, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, DIRCO, was able with, of course, DEA to craft a very balanced package in Durban. Actually a lot more complex than what took place in Paris. It had all the key elements that the world needed at the time. It had the mandate to launch a new negotiation to finalize a global universal agreement, which became the Paris Agreement. It was then also a heated debate were around the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. Nobody talks about the Kyoto Protocol right now, but then it was the most important mitigation international vehicle or protocol, and ensuring its second commitment period until 2020 was key. The Green Climate Fund as well. There was negotiation then to adopt the governing instrument of the Green Climate Fund, which happened in Cape Town a few weeks before the COP, and then the whole transparency regime, transparency on mitigation action and on support was also crafted in Durban. So I think one has to really acknowledge the leadership, and I'm sorry that Alf is not around. He played him and his team and others played a central role in that. But that leadership is not just at the multilateral, let's say at the multilateral level. When it comes to implementation, we have seen key innovative policies coming from South Africa, whether the carbon tax or the national adaptation strategy, or even the renewable energy IPPP, which from every standard is a global, or at least is one of the best international policy put in place to, one of the best domestic policy put in place to drive renewable energy investments on, in any country. So we've seen that. And at the African, so first of all, there is a leadership role, which is there, the expertise, and in all areas, science and policy, implementation, and really at the multilateral fora. Small nota bene, South Africa is the only African country to be part of both the G20 and as well the BRICS. So that gives the country all the platforms at the international level to sort of advance advance the African position and the South African position, which is really fundamentally an African position. But it has those very two important cards, South with the BRICS, as well as in the larger G20, and that's actually critical at this time in a post-COVID world when reforms, global regulatory, fiscal, and financial reforms are being discussed. So we count on South Africa to sort of push the African voice there. Now, on the continent itself, I think Ellen mentioned that South Africa is right now the chair of the AU, but South Africa is also the coordinator. His Excellency President Ramaphosa is also the coordinator of CAOSC, which is the Committee of African Heads of States on climate change. So it has the dual hat, and South Africa will still hold that position next year, going into COP26, and also going into the FOCAC, which Helen also mentioned, and there are very important opportunities that can be taken advantage of. So in the last part of my little talk, I think this is where I would want to focus a bit on how to strengthen that leadership in the next 1 to 2 years. And the first to me is on science and policy, and building on the institutions such as CSRR and others. We have realized that on the continent, for instance, and in most developing countries, the biggest gap is on climate information services and hydromets. And there is looking at what South Africa has achieved, there is a great opportunity for South African institutions to support, not just on the continent, but to support the deployment of hydromet solutions, of climate information solutions, of integrating climate models in macroeconomic models. There's a key place there to be taken by South Africa, in South, and even beyond. I've had the good fortune of participating to a number of seminars at the UCT with Climate Models team, to be surprised at a number of OECD countries and OECD institutions where actually were part of the group. So this goes beyond the capacity and the expertise within the institutions, go beyond supporting South-South cooperation. It can actually be even South-North cooperation. Again, on policies, same thing, whether on the national adaptation strategy, which the cabinet just passed, or the carbon tax, or the renewable energy IPPP. All of those policies to me are world standard, and institutions climate change is fundamentally about institutional capacity. So this is another offer that South Africa can put on the table. In terms of finance, the level of sophistication of Centon, let's say Centon as a financial center, and even DBSA was the only national development finance institution to be accredited to the GCF, has an opportunity to facilitate and financial engineer finance for not just the southern part of the continent, but also the continent as at large, and taking into consideration, as I said, that South Africa is part of the BRICS, so it's part of the New Development Bank, the African headquarters of NDB is in Joburg, AIB as well. So there's also something to be done on the finance part, and in technology as well. The last frontier today on let's say low emission technology is hydrogen, and South Africa is probably one of the it's definitely in Africa the number one in that, but even in developing countries to have a very serious hydrogen program. And the context right now, the Paris Agreement having come into force, we are now into accelerating implementation. And what I tried to expose here, science and technology, policy, finance, those are the key ingredients for any country, let alone African country, to advance and accelerate climate action. And I think that in all those areas, South Africa has a key, competence, expertise at the top level, at world standard level. And there's an opportunity to then aggregate, assemble, articulate all of that in a very robust strategy and advance, and have really a portfolio of solutions which can then be presented at the African level, presented in South-South. So there's an opportunity here for our friends at DIRCO, at DEA, to really have an initiative, a very ambitious and robust initiative, taking into account the fact that South Africa leads the continent on climate change as we speak. And as the African group is actually updating its strategy, there's really an offer, a strategic offer that can be put on the place in a Pan-African setting, but as well as in a South-South setting. As I said, next year we have FOCAC in Dakar. Ellen mentioned that. That strategy can be articulated there at FOCAC. Then we'll have also COP26, and COP27 is in Africa in 2022. So really in the next 2 years, and so we could really put to good use let's say the few months that we have of COVID new reality to structure a very robust initiative. And I think that will go a long way in further strengthening and in further demonstrating South Africa's leadership and role, not just on the continent, but as a global player, and as one of the most influential global player as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador, both for highlighting, also providing some of the historical context, which sometimes we forget in terms of the role that South Africa played, particularly in Durban and in COP16, was COP16?
17.
COP17, correct. COP17, I thought it didn't sound right. In 2011, but also the opportunities presented at this particular critical juncture for South Africa to engage in a continental climate diplomacy. I think, of course, in a similar discussion yesterday, where we looked at the initiative P4G, which was partnering for green growth. Concern was raised around, how much South Africa is stretched in this regard. I think both fiscally, but also probably just in terms of things that are also happening domestically, and how it might be able to play out some of the points that you've raised, Ambassador, not least, of course, in the finance area. But I think there are, as you also elucidated, any number of possibilities, that any number of instruments that in the international and continental terrain and in the South-South terrain that we can look at. Okay, my understanding is that unfortunately we have not been able to connect with Alf Wills. That's a real pity. I know that my colleagues in the back there have been trying to work this out, but I think we're probably going to have to move on without him. If we do manage to get him on, we'll still give him, we'll obviously be keen to give him an opportunity to speak. But what I think I'd like to do now is really move on into the Q&A session. I know that there have been some questions posted both in the chat and in the Q&A. Perhaps before I go there, just a point to make that my colleagues have posted in the chat box two policy briefings. The one is the one co-authored by Ellen and Salim Fakir and Melisha Nagaya, that sort of speaks to the presentation that Ellen made, and it was literally published yesterday. And there is another one that was published a couple of weeks ago that again looks at climate change and COVID and looks at it a little bit more broadly in a global context rather than through the prism of South Africa's climate diplomacy. Please feel free to obviously look at those later on. Okay. So I'm just looking now at the chat function, and let me pose this question. I think it's largely aimed at Ambassador Nafu, and this is, I think, Andrew Gilder, who's saying, please comment on the AGN position on updating the NDCs now that COP26 is postponed, and the extent to which the NDCs will be an AU issue at the EU-AU summit coming up, as we know, in October. Then let me, there is another question here, also from this is from Ado van Rensburg. The question posed is that there is an increasing evidence that the models advocated by the IPCC are seriously flawed. Even if the models are correct, it appears that the cure offered is worse than the disease. A lesson we are learning from the COVID crisis as well. I think that I think that South Africa should put its own need for reliable, cheap energy first and accelerate nuclear and coal-fired power stations. Why are we insisting on ruining the economy for the sake of the highly advantaged EU? Okay, so this is a question about brown versus green, and I think that both Ellen and the ambassador can respond to that. And then lastly, maybe, and then we can revert to you. As COVID-19 has shown, it's important for there to be capacity, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere on the continent too. So how can South Africa use its leadership position to enhance African capacity? Okay, so let's take those three questions, and then we'll revert. And I will also perhaps ask my colleagues Danny and Salim to come in with a couple of points after that. All right, who wants to go first?
I can go first. That's the best part in any in any meeting, really. So the first question, if I got it clear, was on updating NDCs and the African position, and then would that be an issue at the EU-Africa? So, well, the updating of NDC, of course, that's a Paris. It's a Paris commitment. It's a Paris Agreement commitment. And so for us, this is work which a number of African countries, of most African countries, are considering, for a good reason, actually. And for most African countries, it's an opportunity to redress what has happened in 2015. Because unfortunately, in 2015, and this is not just in Africa, most developing countries put together their NDCs in a very sloppy manner, if I can use that term. NDCs are supposed to be really the integration of climate into national development planning processes. And I say processes, meaning local, national, and all kind of levels. And throughout the sectors, an economy-wide process, both mitigation and adaptation. And of course, the Africa Group was the one to say that adaptation had to be a big part of the, had to be part of the problem. And our partners were not, didn't see it that way, but it made it. So it was a lost opportunity for countries to do a very robust, systematic work in exploring the development trajectory and see how climate risks and climate impact would actually influence that, and what could be, let's say the mitigation measures. So we hope that this time, and now with COVID, or with COP26 being postponed until next year, that countries will have more time to sort of do that. To do in-depth national consultations, in-depth quantitative and qualitative work to really integrate climate and development consideration. I'll get to a point in terms of capacity, answering to the last point. On the EU-AU, the conversation could be, and for us, the conversation could be, what could, for instance, the EU provide in terms of support in accompanying African countries in that route? That's the conversation with the EU, not about the relevancy of updating the NDCs, but for us it's an opportunity, and definitely we're more interested in the adaptation part than the mitigation, because Africa is about anyway 2.8 to 3.5% of global GHG. So that's not, but the impacts are what we are facing right now, and what can really derail our development trajectory. So the conversation is, what are the kinds of it's really about international cooperation with the EU on all areas. On the models, definitely the biggest gap, again, I was mentioning, the biggest gap in fighting climate change on the continent is data, is the availability of data, let alone transforming data into information, into models, and downscaling and all of that. But I think this is also an area where South Africa relies on South African teams who have their own assumptions, who produce the data, who produce the inventory, both in for mitigation, as well as the whole data system for climate adaptation. But this is definitely, every country should rely on its own data system and institutions. But again, this is the gap. So I totally agree with the gentleman who made mention to that. Now on the energy mix, interestingly enough, I had a friend who was the lead at CSRR on the on energy, and some of the models that was in 2016. I had the good fortune of being the coordinator of the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, which was launched by African heads of states to accelerate renewable energy on the continent. So some of the models or the scenario I'd seen and this is for South Africa, that it would make more sense from a competitive point of view to have a mix of 70% renewable energy and 30% natural gas. But that was actually more competitive than a coal nuke energy. I haven't seen, that was 2015, 2016. I'm assuming with renewable energy, I mean prices, I mean solar and wind having gone down even further in the last 5 years. But such a scenario would, it would be interesting to look at it with, of course, the cost of storage as well, and adding maybe hydrogen, maybe adding green hydrogen to the picture. I'm not sure. Again, not even from a climate point of view, from a purely macroeconomic point of view, if South Africa wouldn't do better with a renewable energy, so wind, PV, storage, and green hydrogen, if it would be really important. Maybe I should call my CSRR friends and task them to sort of come up with scenarios, and we would see. I'll be very surprised that any scenario will beat that one in 2030 in the next 10 years. So we should look at that. And I'm mindful of just transition. This is in his acceptance speech, President Ramaphosa last year at KAOSK, I think mentioned quite a few times just transition, and I think this is understood. So the economists must run the model, and then we can have a conversation in terms of what kind of international finance also should be provided to support such a transition. And the final question, South Africa's leadership position and how to enhance African capacity, that is being done and can be further supported at many levels within the African group itself. We have, I mean, most of those institutions I've mentioned are mentioned, UCT, CSRR, and others provide scientific and expert input into our work. But there are dedicated African Union climate initiatives, the Africa Adaptation Initiative, the Climate Commission for the Sahel, the Congo Basin and Islands, the adaptation of the African agriculture, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. They are dedicated initiatives where South African institutions can provide knowledge, can provide tools and instruments. But what is maybe missing is a concerted initiative where, or a platform which would sort of aggregate all those solutions and try to facilitate the channeling of those solutions to specific initiatives. So maybe there's this matching platform that that is missing, and this is probably a recommendation for DIRCO to maybe facilitate such a platform.
Great, thank you very much, Ambassador. Ellen?
I think I just want to quickly touch on Ambassador Nafu's point about the electricity mix, and I couldn't agree with Adam more that South Africa needs to put its own needs first, and we need a reliable, cheap energy mix. But coal and nuclear are not providing us that. I mean, we've seen what's happened to the cost of coal, and we also, if you look at the cost of nuclear globally, it's certainly not the solution for cheap, cheap energy provision. And it's also, as Ambassador Nafu had said, it's not just about the provision of energy, it's also about the macroeconomic implications. And what we've struggled with over the past 20 years is diversifying our economy away from what Ben Fine and Zav Rastamji called the mineral energy complex. And the more we entrench our dependence on coal, the harder it becomes to diversify our economy. And renewable energy technologies and clean solutions generally hold a host of opportunities to unlock new economic activities. And as Ambassador Nafu had said, and it's a really important point in South Africa, it has to be done in a way that we don't sacrifice existing jobs. We do need to put some real thought to how we can open these opportunities while ensuring that people are not sacrificed, for lack of a better word, along the way. So it's not about the EU's agenda, it's about South Africa's agenda, and it is about providing cheap energy, but it's also about diversifying our economy. I think, sorry, Elizabeth, Salim and Danny might also have some points. Thanks.
I'd actually like to at this point. There are a few more questions in the Q&A, but I'd like at this point to just maybe bring in Salim with any additional comments or also any questions.
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure to have Ambassador Steeninoff. It's a pity that Alf couldn't make it, because I think he would have also contributed some really invaluable insights, because, you know, people at the heart of the diplomatic fraternity tend to gain, you know, the finer finesse of how governments think about these issues and some of the geopolitical points. But I wanted to present some, you know, set of issues that I think we as the African Climate Foundation are also grappling with. And I think, you know, we have engagements with Ambassador Steeninoff and others across the continent. And it's this, it's not just an intellectual battle, but it's a practical one. You got an economic crisis on the African continent in the COVID period. You've got effectively an international order that's being dismantled. And how do you reorganize, you know, global institutions and channels of trade policy, international development assistance, European Green New Deal, and all the finances that are going to effectively subsidize European production and so on, and also try to repair that in a way that allows a kind of new development agenda to emerge. And I really want to stress on that, because the problem with the climate debate on the African continent is that it's too parochialized into, you know, must be about renewables and it must be about adaptation and resilience. And I say this very provocatively, but actually what it needs to be part of is actually part of a coordinated development agenda for Africa. And that has to be, cannot be done by outsiders. It has to be done by Africans themselves, in this case, under the auspices, not just only of key leading countries and soft power foreign policy, but also boosting the African Union. And in fact, Ambassador Steeninoff, who is looking to set up the mechanisms, he hasn't talked much about it, but he can talk about it just now, so that Africa is in a better position to coordinate its development agenda, because it's in the throes of intense geopolitical, I would say, intrigue on the continent. You know, you've got China, US, Russia, Turkey, UAE, all sort of trying to massage and kind of manage relationships on the continent, which is self-interestly driven, but which Africa cannot avoid because it has to engage the international world. It's a global world. So I think that this coordinated development agenda will give more meaning to climate investments, whether they be in mitigation or adaptation and resilience. And it will also give a far more better structure to the NDCs, because they're kind of little PR exercises, enclaves, where somebody's asked to fill in a stupid form and say, you know, we commit to this, but it means actually nothing, particularly in post-COVID, where the balance sheets of many African countries are actually not going to be able to take on the burden of actually greater infrastructure investments in the climate arena if their foreign reserves are low, their cost of capital is high, and they don't actually fundamentally repair their entire balance sheet and are able to work towards a more longer-term development trajectory. So the way to understand climate issues is to actually connect it more to development, particularly protection of the basic means for livelihood and economic activity. That's the one. Enhancing the ability of the production system in Africa and its supply chain and infrastructure against vulnerability, and to be able to direct more climate investments to meet the objectives of development on the continent. I don't think you can ever talk about climate issues in the absence of that broader framework. Otherwise, it will remain a little enclave, you know, in the domain of a very few group of people going to the Paris meetings, and it's meaningless in the overall picture of Africa. So I just want to throw that really provocative sort of, you know, piece to the debate, because I think we need to get beyond just these rhetorical, you know, approaches to it, but actually figure out how do we make it useful for development on the African continent. Thanks.
Thanks, Salim, and that provocation is, I think, critical. I mean, the other dimension is that, you know, often in national governments and cabinets, the Department of Environmental Affairs or Department of Environment, depending on how different countries call them, are not usually the most important. And I think that's also something that needs to change in this. Well, you know, we're still in a COVID world, and in a post-COVID world, I think it's really realizing that climate is at the center of many of the problems we face, and not least, I think this pandemic, which is also about you know, when you have zoonotic diseases. I mean, jumping from animals to people, that's also partly because of the way in which we're behaving on the planet. So that's another point about where, you know, what role for governments in terms of ministries of environment and the importance they give to it. Danny, is there anything from your side before I move on to a couple more questions in the Q&A box?
Thanks, Elizabeth. I want to thank both speakers for a really rich discussion that we've had. And they've left me with lots of questions, but I can see that there are a lot of people putting up questions. I don't want to take too long. I just want to raise one issue, which seems to me we haven't addressed, which is that we've been talking, climate actually, part of its complication, as we can see, there's the substantive aspects of how do we deal with climate, and then there's the diplomatic issues of how does Africa position itself to get what it needs from the climate negotiations in terms of adaptation and the support that it needs. And we've talked a lot about possible opportunities with states, with POCAC, the relations with the EU, etc. But the one thing I was wondering about is what role is there and how can Africa use non-state actors as a way of leveraging its position in international negotiations? So how can it use local governments, which I know play subnational governments, the cities and provincial governments, which I know play a role in the negotiation? And how can Africa use them? How can it use the private sector, both Africa's private sector as well as in other parts of the world? And then finally, both African civil society organizations as well as transnational and other regional civil society groups. Are there ways that we can use those to leverage Africa's positions in these different, both within the Paris and the COP process, but also within these other forums as well around climate? And I'll stop there so we can get as many questions as possible.
Great, thanks, Danny. Let me then also just pose a couple of more questions from the chat box. There was one, and the Q&A, there was one question about the way in which the AU might be seeing climate change in the context of peace and security. Does the AU consider, and has it begun talking about the negative impact of climate change on peace and security as potentially one of the drivers of conflict? So that's one question, I think, which potentially both of you can answer. Then there is another one on adaptation strategies. Is the regional level relevant for effective climate change adaptation strategies? In other words, can SADC and the other African regional groupings be central in implementing global strategies, particularly around adaptation? Then there is a question which was bound to arise, given that we've been discussing FOCAC, which is what do you think about the should be the priorities for engaging China here specifically? I would imagine around climate change, but what could you unpack what those priorities would be? And in a related question, the EU definitely has to play a huge part in addressing climate change also in Africa. But China is today by far the greatest emitter of CO2 in the world, but still is considered a developing country. What is the African group position on this paradox? And then let me take one more question. And then revert. Although there could be a new impetus to fight climate change in light of lessons learned from COVID-19, on the other hand, to what extent has the impact of COVID-19 been factored into multinational cooperation fighting climate change? And how can individual countries may be unable to meet their obligations due to losses in revenue, time, expertise, and other issues. Let me leave it there, and I'll return to the chat box after this.
Ambassador Nafu, do you want to
take
the first step?
I can maybe start with the easiest question, which is the relevance of the regional level for adaptation. I mean, definitely for let's say for adaptation of programs. I mean, climate change is or the impacts are local specific, so it's more than relevant to consider policies at the relevant level. Whether that's in the river, for instance, in the river basin, it's more than relevant to imagine your climate response at the river basin, or in agroclimate zones such as the Sahel. So that's why the AU set up a climate commission for the whole Sahel region, for the Congo basin, for islands, to sort of create synergies, avoid duplication, and having sharing of lessons. Just because climate change within the same agroclimatic zone, I mean, doesn't stop at the border. So it's more than relevant at an AU level to do that work at the relevant regional. So the devolution is sort of done at the relevant level. That makes sense, and that's what scientists and experts are also advocating for. There was a question on leveraging non-state actors, and I think that's extremely relevant, especially at this in this paradigm where we find ourselves, which is an implementation paradigm. And those actors, especially private sector and local government, are the one driving implementation on the ground. So it makes sense to work with them. I take the good example of the US. So when it announced, when President Trump announced that the US would leave the Paris Agreement, which will come into effect on November 3rd, we've seen an intense activity from local government, private sector, and some of us have had very interesting dialogues and actually even work with the relevant local government and private sector in the US. On the continent, African CSOs, PACJA, to name the alliance, is extremely involved in the work of the African group. Again, the expertise that you find in CSOs on the continent is extremely valuable. Most of our governments unfortunately lack capacity. The Ministry of Environment, as you mentioned, in most countries is not the most capacitated institution in the continent, and that might be actually one of the reasons why, to reply to Salem, who was provocative, and I can try to be as provocative. I mean, climate change is not about environment. Climate change is fundamentally about development. But unfortunately, in most African countries, and I know very well a few of them, the Ministry of Environment simply lacks the capacity and the resources to do that, systematic, comprehensive, quantitative assessment. And you might tell me that, okay, the Ministry of Environment doesn't have to do it. The ministry just needs to coordinate. But coordination is one of the most difficult things to do, because you first of all need to have a very good understanding of where you want to be or where you want to go. And simply most ministries of environment simply lack that capacity. For most ministries of environment, and I'll be provocative here. This is just Seni talking, in my personal capacity. I'm not sure that most environment ministries really comprehend that climate change is fundamentally about development and not about environment. I actually had a TED talk when I said climate change is not about environment, because I get asked, for instance, all the time, why is the city polluted? I mean, why is, plastics on, and I tell colleagues, that's not about, plastics is environment, but it's not climate change, okay? Climate change is really about development, about understanding what is the impact, what are those impacts going to their consequences on your development trajectory in transport, in industry, in energy, in livelihoods. But to do that, you need to have the model. I mean, you need to be able to model your development trajectory. You need to be able to quantify. You need to be able to have an idea in terms of the loss. You need to be able to have, it's a whole economic domain. But for most colleagues at the Ministry of Environment, they don't see it that way. You get into, and I'll take it another step, and I'll stop there for that small parenthesis. When trying to mobilize resources at the international level, for instance, through the Green Climate Fund and others, a lot of the time you have conversation with someone at the Ministry of Environment, and he or she will tell you, well, we should prioritize projects of the Ministry of Environment first. Agriculture and energy, those guys are not in our ministry. We should prioritize our projects first. Anyway, so there's a lot of maybe advocacy which needs to be done, a lot of sensitization, a lot of work really to support ministries in doing that work. Now the latest one on China, the paradox. Yes, the paradox is there that in terms of absolute emission China come first for a number of reasons that can be debated. What is important, I think, to note is China is willing to play its part. At least it's not the country which is not in the Paris Agreement. It's the #1 investor in renewable energy. It's a #1 investor in a number of fields, and is more than interested in cooperating. And what we are sort of working on as we speak is to really have climate change. And when I say we is as Africa, is to have climate change as a separate and distinct cooperation, a pillar in our cooperation framework with China. That's what some of us hope to achieve at the next FOCAC, to really make, not just to integrate climate change in our framework, but to have it as a separate pillar in the cooperation framework between Africa and China. We've done some initial analysis into the areas of such a pillar, whether science and technology, financial instruments, or industry. There's really a lot to work on. So this is what we're investigating. Climate change. We have a climate change cooperation framework with the EU to sort of, and we are trying to mirror such one. And I think that it can be even more ambitious. I'll maybe stop there to take more questions.
Right. Thanks, Ambassador. Ellen?
I think I just want to add a few points to what Ambassador Napowitz said. On the question of the regional level, it's not only important that we build a resilience at the regional level, but it also holds immense opportunity for unlocking economic benefits. And again, like the resilience of our neighbors will determine our resilience, so will the economic resilience of our neighbors. And I think that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is one mechanism African countries are looking at to unlock regional cooperation on economic activity. On the peace and security and climate change, this is, I mean, the impact of climate on peace and security is, I think it's not open to debate. And I think that in West Africa, you've definitely seen incidents of climate-related impacts on security. I know that this is recently something that the UN Security Council has been looking at, particularly, I think, in the Sahel region. And then on Danny's point on leveraging non-state actors, and I think I'm going to talk mainly from a South Africa perspective and not really at the international level, but one of our big challenges as South Africa going forward in our recovery is not only economic recovery, but is also rebuilding the trust. South Africans have lost trust. And talking from a society perspective, the past 10 years were pretty difficult in terms of engaging with government. And there was there's a big opportunity and also a necessity to rebuild trust with non-state actors, and that again will go a long way to building our resilience. And then finally, one point just on China and Europe. I think that Africa is in, despite being very badly affected by COVID from an economic perspective, it's also it has a strategic opportunity. There's a lot of international interest in Africa. There's a lot of geopolitics playing out in Africa, and it has the opportunity to leverage this interest and to really to negotiate better terms for itself. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Ellen. Let me just look very quickly at the next batch of questions, and that will probably then bring us pretty much to the end of the discussion. So a point from Kwaila Monaheng, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that our economic and development systems are not sustainable, as they are now susceptible to global shocks, particularly with regard to the dependence on fossil fuels. Even if big powers have been quite catastrophically affected, because we're not at the center of this global fossil fuel energy mix, can we forge ahead silently post-COVID through renewable energy investment? So it's really looking at those trade-offs. Then there is a question on climate change education in Africa, and speaking specifically about the importance of media viability. As media in developing countries face an uncertain economic future, the question of media viability came under intense review at a panel discussion that UNESCO held a couple of years ago. And so I think the point is being made, if I understand the comment and the question then correctly, is what role can media play in climate change education and the intersect between climate change and development, which I think is at the heart of that. So that's also partly related to the role of non-state actors. Okay, there's another question here on nuclear, which I'll put to you, because certainly in the South African context, nuclear is a discussion, as you know, Ambassador Nafu. This is also from Adu van Rensburg. There are massive developments in nuclear, with the small modular molten salt reactors burning natural thorium and not enriched uranium. The best candidate from a cost, waste disposal and safety point of view. Why do you think that only renewables will get cheaper? And then there is one last question, which is really South Africa focused, I think, and perhaps I'm not sure if you can answer that, Ellen. There's a comment from Anna Thompson. I'm involved in project development primarily in South Africa. What practical incentives are available and whom to contact given development flagships and real job creation on the ground, or the need for real job creation on the ground. Okay, let's leave it there. What I will do is revert to Ellen and Ambassador Nafu, and then also ask if Salim or Danny have any final remarks to make, and then we'll wrap up the discussion.
Yes, so on the easiest one, nuke and renewable energy. I'm actually technology agnostic and I would be more than interested to see the total cost of ownership as well, and as well as I said, a very detailed quantitative assessment. So, for instance, right now, I'm very keen on hydrogen, which may not be, there's green hydrogen, of course, but, this may not be renewable energy per se, at least in the sense of, PV and wind. You definitely don't have the intermittence. You don't have the intermittence when you're talking about green hydrogen. But I'm very keen on that. It's just that, my experience in nuke, at least in reading the literature, I mean, lately the price has been because of the risk and everything else has been going up rather than down. But I'm also paying attention to the smaller ones. I wonder to what extent this is already, how would I say, feasible or close to market. But again, as I said, what's important to me is to have all the macroeconomics information and quantitative assessment, and it's just that. But I mean, what's the trend right now is for at least the intermittent ones plus storage plus green hydrogen to go down in the next 10 years in a substantive manner. But is there place for nukes and others? Maybe. But I'm open. I'm not an anti-nuke person per se.
SAIIA, you finished?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I think on the nuclear, like SAIIA, believe it or not, I'm actually also technology agnostic, and I think that the point that Ambassador Nafu has made about whether the technology is deployed, we can deploy the technology now is an important one. And so I think that if that technology is proven and if the costs are competitive, then of course we need to look at that. But I don't think that's the case now. And if we look at utility scale nuclear around the world, the costs have definitely gone up, and Ariva and France are great examples of that. So until that technology is proven and deployable, then I don't think it's really worth engaging in a debate about small nukes versus renewable energy technologies. And just on the role of media, I think that without a doubt, it's going to play an important role. And I think importantly, as Salim had said, one of the issues that we're grappling with is how to start reframing climate change, not about risks, but about opportunities. And I think that the media can play a very important role in that, looking at the nexus of climate change and development, and looking at the opportunities that climate change have to boost economic activity on the continent and growth and sustainability. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Ellen. Anything from Salim or Danny?
No, I would give it to you, Elizabeth, to conclude. We're running out of time. Thanks.
Okay.
I agree. The only thing I would add is to thank the speakers, but also to re-emphasize the ambassador's critical point that climate is really not just about environment, it's about development, which means it's really about everything. It's about economics, it's about social issues, it's about human rights issues, it's about domestic issues and international issues, which is what makes it such a complicated issue really makes thinking about it in this changing environment such an important issue. But I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to literally end on, Danny, that we need to move beyond sort of the silo approach to climate change, or indeed to the environment specifically, and it's a much broader, has much broader ramifications. And I think if the last few months have shown us anything, it is exactly that this is a truly a transnational, multi-dimensional challenge that can't be handled in a very, very narrow way in a particular sector or through a particular sector, and that we really have to understand its impact on everything, from the way in which we do budgeting to the way we do gender and integrate that into the discussion, and so on and so forth, and indeed also on issues around conflict. So all that is left then is for me really to say a very, very big thank you to our panelists this morning, to Ambassador Sandy Nafu, joining us from Germany, to Ellen Davies, joining us from Niger, and again also very big thank you to Ellen, Salim, and Militia, who have worked with us on these issues in the book and also in the policy briefing. By all means, please visit it and read it. Then lastly, just to do another punt for the book. The book will be the electronic version. The ebook will be out probably in the next couple of weeks. And hard copies will come out a little later after that. The book is called Values, Interests and Power, South Africa's Foreign Policy in Uncertain Times. There's a really excellent chapter there on climate diplomacy, as many of the issues which we have discussed today. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon, and hope to see you on another one of these platforms very soon. Bye.